After that fascinating discussion on what's really happening in China, we're now going to turn, as I said before, from looking at the big picture and geostrategic issues to the very practical question of supply chains and how those are changing and what it means for both businesses and investors and policymakers and, of course, military and security groups as well. I forgot to mention earlier that this entire session is being live streamed. So it is entirely on the record. So if you do want to record it, a couple of people have asked me if they can, that is absolutely fine. And I should also say, by the way, we've not had any beeping from cell phones, but do put your cell phone to silent if you are using one for any reason. So next session is about navigating global supply chain challenges, a US-China perspective, and the moderator is Kamal Saggi, who is a professor of economics here at Vanderbilt, who spent much of his career looking at the question of trade and economic policy making. Over to you, Professor Saggi.
Thank you, Provost Tant. It's a pleasure. Welcome, everyone, to our channel on global supply chains and navigating those challenges, particularly from a US-China perspective. I'm an academic. Academic people like roadmaps. Let me give you one, even though it might be a little bit ambitious for what we plan to achieve, hope to achieve in this panel. We'll begin with a little bit of a discussion about what supply chains are all about and trade, the efficiency that trade can give us versus the risks it can generate for us, and then move on to some specific aspects of national supply chains from a point of view of national security, what risks can arise and how might we deal with them, and then move to a much more of a US-China perspective with those broader discussions and questions in mind. How do those issues arise in the US-China context, and what might we do about them? And then there will be some time also for us to take questions from the floor. So I encourage you to participate strongly. We have an extremely distinguished panel, and they bring rich experiences and diverse perspectives, which I think is going to be lovely. So let me introduce them briefly. I'll start at the far end with Jim Desmond, who is the Chief Security Officer at Asurion, right here in Music City. Previously, Jim was the Chief Security Officer at Elevate, a financial technology firm based in Fort Worth, Texas. Jim has over 20 years of experience in technology and security leadership with a primary focus on financial services. Next to him, Jamil Jaffer, who, if you watch YouTube at all, must have seen him multiple times. Okay? He's the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute and assistant professor of law at George Mason University. Jamil is also director of the National Security Law and Policy Program and the Cybersecurity Intelligence and National Security LLM at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason. Welcome, Jim, and welcome, Jamil. Next, Morgan Adamski. She's director, Cybersecurity Collaboration Center at the National Security Agency. Morgan is responsible for leading complex and groundbreaking initiatives for NSA cybersecurity, specifically focused on co-creating cybersecurity tradecraft through collaboration with industry to change the way we secure the nation. I would be remiss if I do not mention something key about Morgan, that like my daughter and wife, she's a Tar Heel. Go Heels. Yeah, yes, Vanderbilt's great too. Next to me right here, Matt Hartman, who is Deputy Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, also known as CISA. Previously, Matt served as the Acting Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at CISA, and as an Associate Director who led CISA's cybersecurity services portfolio, including, now this is a mouthful, Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation and the Quality Services Management Office. Welcome, Matt. It's a pleasure to have you all here. As I said before, I would like to begin with sort of setting the stage about what supply chains and global supply chains are all about. Why do we have them? So from a trade perspective, this goes back to David Ricardo. We've always understood why we want to trade with other countries. They produce certain goods at lower cost or more efficiently than we do. The traditional example that Ricardo gave was of wine and cloth. Well, we are far away from wine and cloth today. We have complex manufactured goods, but the logic remains the same. If you think about a modern complex manufactured good that has many different components, where do you locate those components, right? So you want to produce them at lowest cost, you find the most efficient locations. Now, as you spread this across the world, you open yourself to additional risks, right? So far-off events, climatic changes, even COVID-19 taught us new lessons about that. Geopolitical issues, military conflict arising in third countries from where we might source products, and so on. So one way of thinking about it from the economic perspective is this trade-off between efficiency versus risks that you might create, additional risks that you might create by spreading production globally. I'm going to ask Jamil to address a question specifically in this context, which is about, has our perspective on the value of global supply chains changed fundamentally, particularly when they involve trading partners that are thousands of miles away or have very different political systems and objectives compared to the United States? And if you could talk a little bit about the general framing of this issue about how do we think about this?
Well, look, I mean, I think as a general matter, our view has changed, right? In the 90s, right, we were all free traders, right? I'm still a free trader. I still think free trade has dramatically beneficial effects for the United States and for our allies. But we have to recognize that that notion of free trade has to be contextualized by the national security imperatives that we face and our trading partners. For a long time, we thought that free trade would simply bring democracy and human rights and capitalism of our variety to countries like China and other countries around the globe. And it turns out we were all wrong. I will admit to having been part of that movement. I mean, I was trained at the University of Chicago as a lawyer, right? Not as an economist, but as a lawyer. But we were still imbued with that notion of free markets and the idea that it's all going to work out if we just bring capitalism to everybody. And the Chinese one-upped us, right? They figured out how to take all the benefits that we saw from it and then use the system to their advantage. And I know we're going to get into China later, but they're obviously the biggest player in the space, and they're the ones that animate our view of this today. And, I mean, let's be candid. It's fine. We don't need to talk about cutting ourselves off from global trade flows or even trade flows with China overnight. It's fine if they make T-shirts. It's fine if they make cloth, or wine for that matter. Wine isn't very good, but right, it's fine. But semiconductors, right, or critical minerals, if they have a stranglehold on those capabilities, that's dramatically problematic for our national security. And we've allowed the situation to develop the way it has because of our commitment to this space and simply taking Ricardo's view and running down the road with that. And now we're realizing the challenges of that. And there are solutions. There are free trade solutions to this problem. It's about engaging in free trade with our allies and people that are aligned with us and bringing people into our free trade network in order to bring them to our side. We have to recognize there are some countries and places in the world who strategically will never be part of that operation. And that's, I think, where this conversation about national security and trade comes into play. But look, I mean, I think the American people are finally coming to grips with that, right? The pandemic, I think, revealed to the American people in a very stark way the supply chain dependencies that we have that can really affect their lives in a way that really matters to them. Right? It's one thing if you can't get your iPhone. It's one thing if you can't get the electric car you want because there's not enough chips of a particular variety. You can't get PPE or pharmaceutical precursors. You can't get vaccines. Now people are like, oh, this is a real problem. Now, have we fully sort of taken that on to the point where we're actually doing the things necessary? I don't think we're quite there yet. But we're on that path, and the American people are now awakened to this challenge, not just with China, but globally. The question is, how do we bring our allies on board with this as well? Because the Europeans continue to play footsie in a way that's not helpful. And we need to sort of bring them on board with, we're not going to win this fight ourselves. They're going to lose it dramatically without us. So we got to make common cause with our allies across the Atlantic and our Pacific allies as well. But really, the Atlantic Alliance is really where I think we have a real problem today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jamil. Thank you. Anybody else want to chip in on this general question about whether we are in a new era with respect to how we view global supply chains? And Jim, I think you may have a different perspective, or you have the same.
I don't necessarily have a different perspective, but I do believe working in the private sector, I'm like Cuba Gooding Jr. and Jerry Maguire. Show me the money, right? So I've got to go where I can get my least cost stuff. And I'm thinking quarter to quarter, maybe year to year, maybe 2-3 years out. And I'm willing to sacrifice certain security, certain things. So without either a disincentive or an incentive from a government body or something like that, I'm likely not going to play ball with something like that. And I'm not saying every company would do that, but it's a difficult conversation for a CEO to have with a board of directors that I've lost margin because I don't want to do business in this country when the competitors are gaining advantage.
And that's a great point. Yeah, so this efficiency perspective the private sector brings, which drives us into supply chains in the first place. But I think Jamil's response here sort of suggests that there could be a coordination issue, which we'll get into a little bit later. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I do think there are long-term effects that suppliers and people in the marketplace have to take advantage of and take account of, right? The idea that simply it's just quarter to quarter and it's just my bottom line tomorrow, that's actually, markets don't operate purely that way. That's a huge driver, right? I was in a company that IPO'd and had its own challenges after IPO, right? But the reality is that you have to take a long-term view of your economics as well. And if you can be cut off from your supply, if you become so reliant on one nation, one supplier, you wouldn't do that in your supply chain for your suppliers. Why would you do that with respect to a country, particularly when you know that the political system is going the other way and potentially militarily, right, or economically, you're going to end up in a world of hurt, right? So you've got to account for that. Your board will account for it. Your CEO should account for it. And if they're simply saying, well, it's quarter to quarter and I've got to make my VIG for that quarter, right, you're not doing right by your long-term stockholders as well.
That's great. I'll let you have a rejoinder later.
And I agree with everything you say until we're behind numbers, right? And then I won't say all bets are off. There are very strategic thinking companies, just like you say, and then there are others that will take the expedient route. But I agree with what you're saying, Jamil.
Okay, excellent. This is exactly what we were hoping for, to have these perspectives, the private sector versus sort of more coordination policy perspective. We'll get more into it. It's going to get, I think, it'll get more interesting as we go along. Okay. So Matt, I'm going to turn to you. So this is sort of, supply chain is kind of a particular kind of trade, right? Trade is broader than that, right? We don't always trade on supply chains. We could trade on key intermediate or key commodities, for example, that don't necessarily have anything to do with supply chains, or key minerals that we might need for certain technologies and so on and so forth. So, or we can think about medicines that we might want to procure from the rest of the world, that India, for example, has become a pharmacy of the world, so is China and so on. So the question there becomes that, well, trade is beneficial. I don't think people dispute that. But there's also this question about a trade-off. Are we becoming too dependent on our trading partners for certain key things that we might need for our health, our economic well-being, our national security overall? So how does one get this balance right between trading with countries, gaining from the trade, mutually beneficial, but not yet creating a dependency situation where our national security might be compromised?
It's a great question. I think, one way to achieve this balance is to let my two peers here go back and forth with their varying perspectives and sort of work their way toward a middle. But I think, balance is the key. Our focus, our aim is to ensure that we are addressing national security threats while not impeding U.S. policy commitment to free international trade and free markets. I think, to answer your question specifically, I think there are two framing points that I think we all should think about. The first is the recognition that my colleagues have already started to talk through, that we are part of an increasingly global economy. Our supply chain, the products that we purchase, that we rely upon, that our critical infrastructure relies upon, the software, the hardware, the services, are riddled with interdependencies. That is not unique to the U.S. I think the second framing element, before we sort of get into how we want to try to achieve that balance from both a private sector and government perspective, is to recognize that we do have adversaries, the PRC among those adversaries, who are not simply seeking to close the technology gap, but really are seeking to disrupt it and seeking to invert it. So I think those are two important framing elements. Now, how do we achieve the balance? What are the elements that we look at when considering what products we can buy from whom and what we want to invest in domestically? The first is the what. What are the technical aspects of the specific product or piece of hardware or software? What functions does it perform? How does it operate? What level of trust or access does it inherently allow based on its function or how it operates? As we're considering within the U.S. federal government what hardware and software we are comfortable running on our systems, that is something that is top of mind to us. The second is the where, and this is really sort of the atmospherics. We should be asking questions about the country of origin. To what extent do laws exist or policies permit foreign governments to compel companies to cooperate in their intelligence activities? The third element is really the who, and that is the specifics. What is the relationship between that company and the foreign government? Does the foreign government have a financial stake in that company? What is the extent to which they can compel, or that company is susceptible to coercion? So I think, as Jamil noted, there are many types of goods and services that we should continue to feel comfortable purchasing from, all of our foreign partners, to include China. There are others that pose a bit more concern from a national security perspective that we really want to look at through that lens and consider whether we need to continue to invest in domestic production.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer.
Can I jump in here
yes,
real quick?
please, Morgan.
One thing I would just comment on, and Matt did a great job about kind of outlining all the things that have to take into consideration with achieving balance, is there's the ideal state and then there's the practical state. So when you talk about national security or the defense community, the People's Republic of China is really good at understanding how we're interconnected, but also our gaps. The fact of the matter is from an acquisition perspective, we're not built essentially to be able to have all these different redundancies or reliance. We rely on single products because that's the way our acquisition cycle is set up. We have contracts, people bid on contracts, we award contracts, then we have multi-year contracts, and that's the capability we have, right? There's a lot of conversations around this right now as it relates to cybersecurity. And the Chinese understand that. So when they understand what product we're relying on, and they understand that we're now into a 5-year contract with that, thank you, Jamal. I would just say that that's a vulnerability that we have to understand our dependency in terms of technology that now we've built an entire ecosystem on. And the fact of the matter is that the public's, the PRC knows that. And they're taking advantage of it, and there's no simple solution. I'm not going to have a solution here on stage. But I will say it is something we have to be very aware of and really understand where those dependencies are and start to build a plan where we have redundancy in place so that if we can no longer rely on a technology or a company or we're cut off from a specific place in the world, we saw this in Russia, Ukraine, how are we going to react? And that's planning, and that's a lot of the conversation we need to have.
Yeah, thank you, Morgan. I'm going to come back to you further on this national security and supply chain question a little bit. But Matt, can I have a follow-up to your big, very comprehensive and very useful answer, which is sort of like, how do we, there's a long and the short of it, right? I mean, go back in history enough, we've had a war with someone or the other, right? So, we go back to World War II, Japan was on the other side of the equation, but now Japan is an ally. When we're building on economic relationships, how does a country think about balancing the long and the short? Not just about which products today, but am I developing key industries or key partnerships in other countries where I see risks, not today, but potentially tomorrow. And how do you balance that? If you want to speak to that a little bit, it would be wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, I'll open it up to my colleagues, particularly from industry, if they want to speak to this. I think, noting that I am here representing the U.S. government, but also specifically the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency,
sure.
We are not as focused on foreign policy, economic trade.
Sure.
We are really focused on securing and ensuring the resilience of U.S. critical infrastructure. So we are really looking at both, near-term risks and long-term risks and balancing those equally. We do not get as much into the space of what our partners at Treasury and our partners at Commerce might be focused on with respect to international trade. But I think one area that we remain extraordinarily focused, which I think we'll get into a bit later in this conversation, is what are the risks really stemming from the People's Republic of China. We are in a new era where, for the first time, we can say in an unclassified setting like this that the PRC is targeting our critical infrastructure for the purpose of gaining access to conduct disruptive or destructive attacks in the future. That is not something that we've been able to say previously in a setting like this, and it is really just an interesting dynamic in sort of pivot as we think about what work can we collectively do between government and industry over the next really critical several years to make sure that we do understand where technologies may exist in critical infrastructure that may present risk to the services that Americans rely upon every day.
Thank you, Matt, also for clarifying. Morgan, I'm going to come back to the question we had raised a little bit earlier about global supply chains. And here, we talked about the general trade-offs involved, risk versus efficiency. But what about the particularities? What are specific industries, products? And I think you hinted that a little bit, Matt, in your answer earlier. What are some of the leading case studies, if you like, that we should be concerned with. I'm thinking in particular here a little bit about the semiconductor industry, the CHIPS Act, and if you can speak to that about what are the touch points here that are really critical for national security on the supply chains.
So semiconductors is critical to national defense, right? It is big in everything that we do, from radars to communication to navigation systems. The fact of the matter is, and General Hawk commented on it earlier, when you think about a weapon system or a platform, it is a flying, floating, driving computer system. And so you think about just how broad that is across DoD, the Department of Defense, and U.S. national security. And the fact of the matter is that when you look at it, a couple years ago, 16% of that technology was actually created domestically. 16%. I mean, that's huge when you think about how impactful that is for DoD. And right, that's down from 37% in the 1990s. And so that's a dramatic shift. And so the CHIPS Act, right, in 2022 was impactful in the fact that we're talking about $280 billion infused into research, into an investment, and really incentivizing the semiconductor industry to build that capability over 10 years. But 10 years, I mean, that takes time. And so, if you're thinking about, okay, the U.S. military needs to modernize their capabilities, their weapons platforms, how do we do this quickly? I mean, the good news is that I think the year report from the White House said that there was like a $166 million investment from companies in semiconductor technology. There are colleges, community colleges, that have stood up a workforce to specifically support that surge. But as we do that work, it's the bottom line. People are going to want to exploit those companies. They're going to exploit that industry. It comes back to the conversation that we're kind of having across the board is, how fast can we get it while also ensuring that security is baked in, functionality over speed. Right. And so how do you have both? Yeah. And that gets really difficult. And so I think there are some really good things that have happened, right? National Defense Authorization Act. Most recently, Department of Defense actually tasked NSA, my organization, to work with semiconductor companies on all of their cybersecurity. So that's something that we're doing. But it is going to be a huge reliance for us. And how do we close the gap while we're still building the capacity over the next 10 years, let alone all the weapon systems, right? Semiconductors are critical and GPUs are critical for AI. And that's not specifically what the CHIPS Act is all about, but it is talked about. And so as everyone is looking at how do we take artificial intelligence and infuse it into national security systems, national security, national defense, help us to do our work faster, there's not enough actual chips to be able to do that. And so it is a huge industry for us and something that's critical to national security. Yeah,
fantastic. I think this also dovetails with a question that came up earlier. And Jamil, I may pull you into this if you're willing to do so. The Taiwan question. Right? Why do we care about Taiwan? One of the questions that came up, right? Clearly, they've been an important supplier of semiconductors in the world. They're one of the leading firms, are Taiwanese-based. And this question of reshoring production back to the United States through some industrial policy on semiconductors obviously is motivated by lowering some of those risks that Morgan was just mentioning. You want to speak to that a little bit about how this fits in together?
Look, I mean, the idea that we're going to onshore and even a significant percentage of our semiconductor production is laughable, right? The $280 billion is a hugely important investment and one that was critical we needed to make, but it's not even scratching the surface, right? We need to invest tremendous amounts more if we're going to really create some amount of independence from China and its near abroad. But the reality is we don't actually need to do that. Yeah. What we need to do is be very clear about where we are on Taiwan. That any threat to Taiwan is unacceptable to the United States, and we will pick a fight over it if need be. The president has been clear 3 times. 3 times on national television, the president of the United States has said, if Taiwan is attacked by China, we will use our military to defend it. 3 times, Jake Sullivan has come out on stage, immediately following the president, said, well, what the president really meant was we'll send weapons. So it's not surprising the Chinese are confused about where we are. It's not surprising the Taiwanese are confused about where we are. And we can say 9 times out of 10, well, the Taiwanese don't really want to defend themselves, and so we're not going to be there if they're not going to be there. But the reality is, whether the Taiwanese want to defend themselves or not, we are reliant upon them, period, full stop. And we can spend a decade trying to get better, and we will get better, and this investment's important. But it's not just Taiwan. We got to be able to invest overseas. We've got to get other allies on board. We've got to get the Europeans on board with investing in semiconductors as well. We cannot do it all ourselves. We cannot onshore it. It's just too expensive to do that construction and that capability in America. And frankly, all these factories we're building in the United States, you know who's going to run all of them and where the STEM talent is? It's not in this country. It's in Taiwan. And so, yes, over a decade and a half, we'll build up the STEM capability. But today, that STEM talent is overseas. And by the way, we bring a lot of the world's smartest, most capable engineers to the United States. We train them in our PhD programs. You know what we tell them? You got to go home to your home country to build your capability, build your startup, because we're not going to let you stay here because our immigration laws are so stupid as to say, you know what, let's have an immigration system that forces the smartest that we train here in our best universities, force them to go overseas, and then, by the way, the people we do let in, we'll let them in on a lottery basis. It's almost like you take a stupid system and you make it random.
Yeah, Jamil, I should point out that the system is not terrible. It did let me in. Just saying.
You and me both, right? My parents came here, right? We're ethnically Indian. My parents came here from East Africa, but we came in at a time when the immigration system was a lot more wide open in the 70s, right? Today, how do smart Indian scientists get in the United States? It's either a lottery, it's family, or they get on an H-1B.
H-1B, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But how many H-1B? The H-1B is a tiny percentage.
Yeah.
We should be taking every smart engineer who we train in our PhD programs and having them stay here. Build your companies here, become part of the American dream. And by the way, if we vet people the right way, we can let Chinese PhDs in here too, because they don't want to build in China. They want to build here.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that impassioned plea for better immigration policy. Yeah, that deserves the hand.
So excited to sit next to him.
Jim, do you have any different view on this sourcing question that, you know, we are relying on time?
Absolutely not.
I
It's
thought
hard
you
to have a different view after a standing applause.
Yeah. Do you want to trade seats? No. Just okay, just kidding. Okay, so this is great. Thank you so much. So we've talked about the risks that supply chains create for us, right? What might happen if we can't source critical things that we really need? Semiconductors is a great example. Morgan talked very clearly about that, and you know what we might do to create other sources, bring production back, and so on and so forth. But what about deliberately using supply chains as a tool? Think of it from the other perspective, right? Not the risk it creates for us, but the leverage it gives us, right? And does it? So Matt and Morgan, I'm going to ask you to jump in here a little bit. In what ways can supply chains, although like the SolarWinds incident in 2020 is an example, this incident was largely attributed to the Russians, but what is to say that it can't happen from China or somewhere else? Can you talk a little bit about how we might think of this as a tool as opposed to just being worried about what it might do to us?
Sure. So happy to start. To your initial point,
Yeah.
just because SolarWinds was, the cyber attack colloquially referred to as SolarWinds was at the hands of the Russians does not in any means lead us to believe that other adversaries, China, cyber criminals, Iran, et cetera, could not be leveraging similar tactics. I think what makes this type of attack so attractive to our adversaries is that it allows you to compromise one and then achieve results at a very significant scale. And that is what Russia was attempting to do with the SolarWinds supply chain compromise. Since you asked about SolarWinds specifically, I will dimension my response specifically to software supply chain attacks. I think it's important to note, again, up front, that modern software is not generally written from scratch. It contains open source code, proprietary code, third-party APIs, literally hundreds of dependencies. And this is what makes it such an attractive target for our adversaries to, again, gain a foothold and sometimes unwittingly gain access to customers' third-party environments from that initial foothold. What we are doing across the U.S. government, and a lot of this was from the Biden-Harris administration's Executive Order 14028 that came out at the beginning of this administration, immediately following SolarWinds, is really a few things. First, within CISA and more broadly across the U.S. government, across industry, and with our international partners, we are pushing a message of secure by design and secure by default. We are pushing a message of radical transparency. We need to have software bills of material. We need to know what are the components of the software that our governments, that our critical industries are relying upon every day, so we can quickly understand if we are seeing an attack, if we are seeing a campaign. It took us more time than it needed to in the days that ensued following SolarWinds to understand the breadth of impact across the community. And that is an area that we need to continue to get better. Another area that we're driving out of Executive Order 14028 is a focus on really dimensioning what are categories, what are characteristics of critical software that we need to pay additional attention to and further safeguard. That is something that we are doing for government, but that we publish publicly to ensure that critical industries, private sector owners and operators are able to benefit from it. We recently, in close partnership with our friends at the White House, launched an effort to ensure that anybody who is doing business with the federal government in selling software to the federal government is submitting a secure software attestation form. This is just self-attestation. It is not the panacea, but it is a start. So again, these are areas that we're really focused on, and just in terms of transparency in what components exist in software, so we can help better understand and dimension the problem. The other thing that we learned from SolarWinds was just that there were some basic challenges that persisted across fairly sophisticated federal civilian departments and agencies and fairly mature and sophisticated private sector partners where we weren't doing enough of the basics. We didn't have sufficient logging in place. We didn't have sufficient focus on identity and access management. We didn't have sufficiently implemented MFA, phishing-resistant MFA across all services. So there is work that we have done in the wake of SolarWinds in part of the American Rescue Plan Act to work across the 102 civilian executive branch agencies. I know NSA is working this similarly. DoD has similar efforts to gain really additional granular visibility at the host level, so we are able to see if an intrusion does occur on a system or network, has the adversary been able to move laterally? Has the adversary been able to gain a foothold, to elevate privileges, to leverage living off the land techniques? We are really focused on these types of techniques that we see the PRC and other sophisticated adversaries, and quite frankly, cyber criminals and ransomware gangs beginning to use to really blend in and make it harder for for defenders to detect their activity.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We learned a lot, it seems like. Morgan, do you want to chip in there?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. Matt did a great job of characterizing a bunch of different efforts and things that we learned from SolarWinds. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, do you know your supply chain risk better than the Chinese? Because at the end of the day, they understand where the vulnerabilities are. And so if you do not understand where you're getting specific components, software, technology, and you are putting it into your network, the Chinese know where those vulnerabilities are. They're going to take advantage of it if it is in their choosing or to their advantage. And we've seen them been able to do that rapidly. It is not a year-type plan. They are discovering it, and they are moving as quickly as possible. And so that's what we've learned is we've had to have some really hard conversations from SolarWinds of like, okay, wait, what open source software, what open source libraries do we actually rely on? Where are they in the US government? What could be exploited? And I know Matt talked about some of the things from SBOM all the way to understanding just what technology's in place, what logging's in place. But I would also offer, when it comes to open source code and things that these things are based on, one of the conversations that I know we're trying to drive at NSA, and General Hawk alluded to it this morning when it comes to curriculum, is the value of having secure coding classes in the curriculum in college, right? How do we build it from the ground up? How do we do secure by design, secure by default? We really have to start a lot of investment earlier on in the pipeline when it comes to our talent on how do we secure this technology, so when we put into our networks, we don't have to have the same conversations. I will also say the continuous monitoring when it comes from a supply chain perspective is really valuable because we oftentimes hear that a specific technology or specific capability is exploited and people are like, well, wait a second, we validated that and it looks great and we put it in national security systems. We should be good. Okay, well, the way that it was implemented and put into the network, people actually turned a few things off and that wasn't great and the Chinese actively exploited it and we didn't know that. And so how do we just have a constant, continuous evaluation of what we're doing in terms of our networks that we care the most about from a supply chain perspective?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Jim, I'm going to, yeah, go ahead.
If you don't mind, I love everything you guys said. More, please, and faster would be amazing, right? A lot of the things that you talk about, SBOMs, right, getting that software bill of materials, which is where you know everything that's coming into your environment and all that stuff, those cost money. And now I sound like the guy who's like, I don't have any money, you got to make it happen. But we need to be able to have our competitors under that same thing. Now, there is a competitive advantage to being secure, and don't get me wrong, and that's what we do. But we play a game of reasonably secure in the private sector, right? I got to get to a point where I'm reasonably secure, where I protect the investment of my shareholders, my customers, and all that. And that's where we focus. If I start expanding that, I start eating into our bottom line. And by and large, at least my investor, our board of directors and leadership are good with that. But we have to be careful where that is. It's one of the reasons I love what you said about security code by design and teaching those who are coming out of college. That's the kind of skill set that I can leverage. The other part is when I said to you is that we need incentives and disincentives and maybe even regulations. I'd love to see something like a NERC SIP for cloud security providers, right? Like if we'd done that to Microsoft's Exchange Online at the end of last year, maybe some of the things that they had done, and I think it was the Cybersecurity Review Board came out on that one, at least held accountable, but maybe they would have had a better attention towards the security because of how instrumental they are.
I mean, I want to say a couple of things.
Yeah, please.
One, can we stop calling SolarWinds and just call it Microsoft?
Okay.
Right? I mean, let's be real, right?
It's hard to argue with you. I'm going to just take it.
At the heart of SolarWinds, and I think the CSRB report demonstrated this in the exchange context, but it's true across the board, right? We have a dominant supply player that has not kept up its security where it needs to be, right? This is a problem for the federal government because 90+% of our collaboration software is built on that capability. And I'm not saying we need to stop using Microsoft. We need to hold them more accountable to do a better job, as the CSRB laid out in excruciating detail. And that's true across a lot of our suppliers. It's not exclusive to them. And I think the CSRB made some interesting recommendations. But I think more importantly, it's important for public companies and companies that trade that are in the public markets to have to meet their bottom line and deal with investors. But it's also incumbent upon investors. So in addition to my job at Mason, I'm a venture capital investor at Paladin Capital. We just made a decision with 9 other venture capital investors to make clear that we're not going to invest in adversary technology. We're going to invest in American capabilities, American technology, and we're going to show our companies build secure by design, build resilient by design. We've committed publicly to a set of commitments around these ideas. And I think we need to expect more from our investment community because at the end of the day, truth be told, those investments are better investments. Those investments have a better return profile for our limited partners, right? If you have a huge investment in intellectual property, and that intellectual property is defended against adversaries, that's going to return better returns. We demonstrate that across the board, time and time again. And so you can benefit your investors by doing it the right way. And by ensuring you're building secure by design, by building resilient by design, these long-term plays, and I get it, you're in the markets, you've got to deal with the reality of what your investors hold you accountable to. But in the startup environment, as venture investors, we can hold our companies accountable for the return profile we want. And so you can both do good and make money doing it. There is no dichotomy between the two.
Yeah. That's a great point. I think, Jim, I heard you sort of raise the question about, how does the private sector mitigate risk? Because it's expensive. It's going to cost a lot of money. So if you want to speak a little bit more to that, I think Jamil kind of pointed an outlet there that the private sector can help each other. It isn't individual enterprise's responsibility, but the investors and the angel investors and all of that, Al Group, can step in and mitigate some of those problems. Is that something you would agree with?
Yeah, 100%. As a matter of fact, we've started partnering with CISA and other groups, and then the ISAC, FSISAC, when we're part of amazing stuff. We've been working against a threat actor called Scattered Spider. Some of you guys might have heard of it. We've been working with them, and the private sector cooperation that we've built, the intelligence that we've been able to pull together has been outstanding, right? And if we can harness that together, I think we could really make a dent in some of this supply chain attacks, right? Because they're really attacking that trust, and being able to help each other detect it and then move faster.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I have one final question on this security and cybersecurity business, and I think, Morgan, this is going to go to you. So sort of a general question. What is the importance and role of cybersecurity standards, right, for emerging technologies and US-China tensions in that space? So speaking specifically to that.
Yeah, this is something I'm really passionate about, maybe not as passionate as some of my other panelists, but I will do my best. So what I would offer is that when you talk about cybersecurity standards, the fact of the matter is that the People's Republic of China is coming out in a big way when it becoming involved in the standard development organizations, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing, that's a good thing. We don't want to have a bifurcated standard strategy. We want to make sure that all countries are following the same type of cybersecurity standards. But we are seeing that the People's Republic of China, they are really having malign influence and putting in specific standards proposals that are potentially jeopardizing emerging technology, like 5G and 6G and IoT and smart cities. And this is the technology we're going to rely on in the next 5 to 10 years, right? I would point to a PRC publication, which we call the Standard Strategy of 2035, I believe, for the PRC, where it specifically states that they want standards with Chinese characteristics. Right? And that should tell you where the priority is from a security perspective. And so we want to ensure with industry, with US government and our allies across the world that we really have an active presence in these standard development organizations, because I don't want to sit on stage. I mean, I love these guys dearly, but I don't want to sit on stage in 5 years having the same conversations about the same technology with the same problems because we haven't addressed it in the future space. And so I think that is one really key element when we talk about cybersecurity and how we are countering PRC influence in the technology domain, is how actively involved we are in these standards bodies and ensuring that future technology is secure, it has the right security evaluations, it's in place, and we can trust it from day one.
Yeah, great. So these bodies you're talking about, these are basically private sector initiatives that are international. What is the scope of these bodies?
Some of the standard development organizations are private sector run, so 3GPP, right, IETF. But when you talk about, there are other government run standards bodies. There are a ton of them as they relate to specific technology. There are working groups that underpin them. You can find a lot of information about it publicly. But some of these bodies are not one country, one vote. It's one person, one vote. Yeah. And we see our adversaries actually incentivizing individuals to attend these standard development organizations, these working groups, just to vote on their behalf.
Yeah. Okay, great.
And they don't necessarily have the technical background to be able to speak to it. Yeah. So good standards, technical talent, let's put them forward and let's secure that technology.
And this is why it's so important, the work that Morgan and the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center is doing at NSA, because, and the work that CISA does with industry as well, because it can't just be the private sector on its own in these standards bodies or the government on its own, right? You've heard a lot recently about the need for the US government to get more engaged in these standards bodies. That's certainly true, but we got to get our private sector with us as well, singing from the same songbook. Right, that's the key, is we got to be on the same page and recognize the adversary is not the industry and government, the adversary is the other side, right? And they are making a concerted effort to undermine global standards and insert their things. And the nice thing about the Chinese, to be candid, is they've told us what their plan is. You don't have to figure it out, right? They're very clear in their doctrine and their actions about where they are and the efforts they're trying to make. We're just not paying attention.
Thanks, Jamil. Jim, did you have anything to add there? Or I thought you
I'm going to echo this, but we're in a significantly asymmetric fight, right? The coordination, the central push, the command level function that the PRC has is amazing. I mean, I'm not a fan of theirs, but I can appreciate what they've done. We've got to get our act together and figure out how we're going to our allies together, our own people together, and build the necessary mechanisms to combat it and win.
And incentives are the key, right? You talked about incentives earlier, right? We often, in the government, right? I was in the government for a long time. We tend to think in terms of how can we force people to do what we want, right? The better play every time is to align your incentives with the others, with private industry. And why do I say that? It's because I'm a recovering lawyer, right? And lawyers, as soon as you provide,
I'm a practicing economist, and I agree with that.
There you go. Right. So you know this, right? Because as soon as you put a disincentive on a private sector company, the first thing to do is call their lawyer and say, "What do we do?" And the lawyer says, "Do as little as possible, as late as possible."
Yeah.
And even if the government says 72 hours and tell us everything, all right, we'll do it right the 71st hour and 59 minutes, and we'll tell you everything that we have to, but not a single thing more. On the opposite side, if you say, hey, if you tell us everything within 72 hours, you can tell us every single thing, we'll give you liability protection, we'll give you regulatory protection. Now all of a sudden, the lawyers are like, tell them everything. Tell them it all in the third hour, right? Because they want to get that liability protection and that carrot. And I get there are reasons why we don't do that all the time. But we have got to, if we want to be real about public-private partnerships, we got to stop talking about disincentives and start talking about incentives.
Yeah. 100% agree with that. I think that's absolutely spot on. So let's get to, I love that. Look what happened. So we've been dancing around this question a little bit. I think in my own research too, I've thought a lot about this question of intellectual property protection and the frictions that has created between US and China, right? So there's a long history on this. It's not the first time the US has talked about it. Since the 80s, the US government has been producing documents, documenting abuse of intellectual property of US businesses abroad. China was a big one. India was another one. Brazil, some of the other countries. But China certainly was one of the bigger ones. And so we had a strange phenomenon at play in the 90s. And China opens up in the 1978, slowly. And then market starts growing. And then for a long time, for several decades in a row, China is the biggest recipient of foreign direct investment, particularly from the United States, right? In an era when intellectual property was basically unprotected or very weakly protected, such as even the case today. So there's a sort of a strange dichotomy there where we talk about the importance of intellectual property protection for American business, but at the same time, it seemed to me as an economist that American business was tripping over itself to get into the Chinese market. In an era which they very well knew that this is not a secure intellectual property regime. So this issue came up before about what can the private sector do? Is the private sector acting too much in isolation and is not properly coordinated? Did they concede too much on the technology transfer angle? For example, China today is requiring that US businesses that want to have major presence should share technology with local companies if they want to operate there. Wholly owned subsidiaries are being curtailed or taxed at a higher rate and so on and so forth. So where's the private sector in all of this? Has it got it wrong?
I don't know if I could say if we've got it wrong or not,
Yeah.
right? That feels like a career-limiting move, so I'm going to move away from that.
I do a lot of that.
What I can say is I've got a friend who's a patent attorney in a big law firm, and when you file a patent in China and somebody violates that patent and you go to litigate in China on it, there's an above 90% chance, well into the 99% chance, you're going to lose. Right? And also, if you don't use your patent for a certain amount of time in China, they take it. The government takes ownership of that patent, so you lose. The game is rigged over there. That being said, my friend, the patent attorney, still has lots of clients that are filing patents in China in a bid to break open that market. There is still a belief, and whether it's true or not, that this will become a free market, that we will prevail and we will be able to, I know, I can see your head shaking, that we will be able to open that market. I'm going to stop there.
Yeah. I'll let you chime in.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
look, I think the challenge is that we all know the IP problems in China. We've known them since
Yeah.
music and videos are stolen. Right now, it's core intellectual property, right? And I don't mean to beat up. I use Microsoft Word, Excel, all the apps. I have an Apple obsession, right? And yet, those companies have decided that the trade-off to sell their wares and to build their wares at a cheap cost is worth putting their IP and making their IP subject to, access by the Chinese government, right?
Yeah.
IP is stored in China. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, crazy.
Stored there. Yeah.
Stored there, right? Core intellectual property. But you got to ask yourself, right, from an economic perspective, they see a massive market.
Yeah.
We see a massive market, always have, right? The question is that market really going to be accessible to us? Or are they simply playing Lucy and Charlie Brown with the football, where they keep setting it up, we keep running up, and they pull the ball, and we fall down? And we never learn the lesson. Mm-hmm. I mean, how long is it going to be before we learn the lesson? The Chinese market is never going to open up.
Yeah.
It's never going to be open the way we want it to be open, and they've been fooling us for decades.
Yeah, no, this is a great point. I mean, so the U.S. is a market-based competitive system where businesses go it alone, compete against each other heavily, not just against other businesses, but within the country, outside abroad. So it could suggest a coordination problem from the U.S. perspective, that it's not in the national interest to be sharing technology so easily and so quickly because you can make a quick buck. But it's in the interest of the private sector, individual firm to do so. They are worried somebody else will do it if they don't do it, right? So I'm not sure I have an answer, but it requires some kind of cooperation, I think, between the private sector and the public sector in the United States to get this right. And Jim, did you have any thoughts about that kind of cooperation?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just going to echo what he says. We got to get our partners and our allies together, and we've got to commit to doing this in the right way, right? I said it before, and I'll say it again, the game is rigged, right? We play anyways because we might still win a Cupid doll or whatever it is, or might win a stuffed animal because we have to, right? Yeah. But I do believe that we need to get in there, and as you've said multiple times, we need to help rig the game a little bit back in our favor.
Can I be the devil's advocate here a little bit further? So 1995, the World Trade Organization formally comes into existence. Along with it comes into existence the intellectual property agreement called TRIPS, where the US was obviously heavily involved, along with the Europeans and the Japanese, getting those rules designed and making sure developing countries adopted rules and regulations on par, at least on paper, with those in the United States, right? What's been the result of that effort? How do you assess that? Has it failed entirely to get intellectual property where it needs to be in countries where it was supposed to be weak?
No, I mean, I think WIPO and WTO have been relative successes for us on the free trade agenda and the IP agenda. I think there are real benefits and gains. I think we have not been clear-eyed about the threat that certain players play in this space, right? When our adversaries behave in extortive ways, right, requiring us to enter into joint venture agreements with Chinese providers, requiring us to transfer IP, requiring us to hold IP in China, right? At some point, as a rational economic actor, even one that responds on a quarterly basis to market pressure, you have to say, does it make sense for me to put my core IP in a safe room in China and let the Chinese government have access to it? And if it does it make sense for the US government to say, okay, we're not buying your products anymore because we can't trust them? Right? When you leave your encryption keys open and accessible and get them owned, and you do it over and over again, at some point the US government should say, maybe we got to change our procurement ideas. Right? Otherwise, the incentive is to not do anything because as a rational market actor, you're like, look, they keep telling me they're going to do something about it, but they're still buying my products. I'll just keep doing it.
Yeah, so the individual incentives are along those lines. Yeah, sure. Okay, so I hinted at this already earlier, right? So the US businesses investing in China, right? Over decades of billions of dollars flowing into China on a regular basis has led to trillions of US stock of foreign investment in China, okay? So when we talk about walking away from China or whatever the word might be, decoupling or divorcing to some degree, divorce is never easy. But in this case, it's particularly hard, right? So look at what we have at stake. So the flip side, of course, is the Chinese hold tons of US debt, right? Now we can inflate our way out of it. We can say, okay, this debt is worthless, but that hurts all of us too, right? So can the panel in general, I'm going to begin with you two, talk about this situation where we have locked in investment and debt in two directions, and yet we are talking about as if we need to break this up somewhat?
Shocking that I have a hot take on this. Okay. Look, if you're, and I can only speak as a venture capital investor, right? Yeah. But if you're an investor that benefits from the free flow of capital and the ability to allocate capital freely, you have a responsibility to defend that system, that political and economic system. And if you're investing in China, you're undermining that system. So I don't accept that that U.S. investors should say, well, it's a really good deal and I really need to make money over there. Because frankly, the evidence shows investments in China, including in AI companies, is actually a bad bet. It's been a bad bet for decades. It's still a bad bet today. But even if it wasn't a bad bet, if you're going to benefit from this system, and you're going to be able to, and you're going to incorporate here, and you're going to have your LP agreements here, and you're going to do all that here, then you should recognize the system only works when you have a free political system and a free market economic system. And when you invest in systems that are autocratic and unfree, you're undermining the ability of this system. It doesn't have to be in the U.S. It can be our allies as well. But if you're investing in non-free market economies and autocratic societies, you're undermining the system, and you're undermining your own capability to make returns for your investors.
So you would actually advocate at reducing those investments going forward?
We've committed to that.
Yeah.
Our firm and 9 other venture capital investors publicly have committed to that because it is not, first of all, it's not a good bet. Second of all, it undermines the very system that allows us to make those bets.
Okay, thank you. Any other take on that? Larger question, debt and investment with China? Okay, because quite often the conversation is only about trade, particularly when one thinks about supply chains, you get locked into a trading perspective. But a lot more is at stake in this economic relationship than just trade. So that being the point. So I want to move quickly now, given our time here, to a couple of recent episodes, flashpoints in US-China relationships, which illustrate the deeper issues at stake, which all of you have spoken very eloquently about. Morgan, I'm going to start with you. It's on a conference on cybersecurity. It's funny that we have not yet mentioned artificial intelligence whatsoever. But let me pitch that question to you. So what about in the AI domain? What should we be doing in terms of a national security perspective with respect to China?
Yeah, so from a national security perspective, I'll bring it back to protecting IP, right? We want to maintain and encourage and take that US competitive advantage in the artificial intelligence realm. And so when we look at, from a national security perspective, we look at the companies that are creating this unique technology. It's a technology that we want to infuse in the Department of Defense and in the national security community. We want to ensure that these companies who are moving fast, got great technology, are working with international partners, are quite honestly protected from things like cyber adversaries who are going to look to steal that technology and use it to their benefit. And so how do we ensure they have the basic cyber hygiene that Matt talked about? They understand the threat, the adversaries, what their capabilities are, both sophisticated but rudimentary, that's going to take advantage of the fact that they're new, they're shiny, and they have things that people want. And so I think that's a key focus for us in the national security community is how do we protect these companies and ensure they have the same protections that we're trying to provide to all else of critical infrastructure, are the Department of Defense and the defense industrial base. Secondly, when we look at artificial intelligence from a national security perspective, we want to understand how our adversaries are going to use it, right? We don't think it's some massive hype where it's going to change the game overnight, but we do believe that they're going to be able to leverage that technology to move faster. right? When we talk about the People's Republic of China, we know that when it came to the Hafnium compromise, the Microsoft Exchange compromise, or the vulnerability that they had, the Chinese were able to essentially see that vulnerability. And when we talked about it publicly and called them out for it, they doubled down. They went faster. They exploited more entities. Right? If they're able to use artificial intelligence to be able to do that at scale, which they're able to do at scale already, like that's daunting. But the good news is that artificial intelligence will also help us as cyber defenders, right? It's going to be able to determine what is our tech debt, what is our networks, where are all of our vulnerable devices, how do we patch this at scale? There's a lot of cyber defenders right now that are terrified of Patch Tuesday because they're exhausted. And so how do we leverage the technology on the defensive aspect as well? And then lastly, how are our adversaries going to exploit AI technology in terms of an AI network, all the way from data collection to deployment? There are unique and novel techniques that are going to be created, that are being thought of. And so how do we protect the AI networks and systems from those type of attacks?
Fantastic. I want to let anybody else weigh in on that question on AI.
Yeah, I'd love to. The thing that scares me about AI, right, except for that I can't wait for Skynet to come in and take care of everything, right? It scares me is that traditionally when we think about technology systems, I have a client in a database, right? And I go and I do some computation and I get my data back and I do my thing with it. Using generative AI and large language models, where that answer you got came from is much more obscure, and you've got to get a team of wizards that sort of have to do a psychoanalyze your LLM, and I'm being tongue-in-cheek, but they really have to do some deep analysis to figure out what was broken. There is a significant threat vector here in poisoning our large language models, right? And if I'm an insidious, persistent attacker, like the PRC or some of their threat actor groups, I look for ways to affect the generative AIs that not only running my adversary, but also the ones that are defending, especially in the cyber side. So don't look for this IP address, and I'm being a little ham-handed about that or a little blatant about it. But I would look to poison those things in such a way that I would become undetected for the thing that I wanted to do.
Thank you, Jim. This is such an interesting panel. I could talk to you guys all day, but I don't have all day, neither do you. I have one final question I want to put to you from the floor, which any of you should be happy to take, or if not, we can move on to some other question. I have several of them. The first, I think that's really got my attention, is the healthcare industry accounts for about 25% of government spending, which is true. We spend a lot on health. Are there any concerns that our adversaries might target that industry by proxies as a mechanism of increasing economic strain on us? Are we concerned about that? Attacks on our healthcare system, given how locked in the economy is on that particular sector?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start quickly. We are very concerned, not solely on the fact that our nation-state adversaries may be locking in on this particular sector for economic reasons.
Right now.
Right now. But what we are seeing right now is just a tremendous focus on this sector from ransomware gangs and cyber criminals that is extraordinarily concerning, and is work that, between Morgan's team, between CISA, the FBI, and our friends at HHS, we're focused on every day to ensure that we are getting information out about these actors, about the techniques and tactics that they are using, about how they are gaining access to these systems, which is really a national security and a public health emergency.
Great. Anybody else want to add to that? The healthcare side? Okay. I think I can squeak one question in, a final one. Are there specific areas that China is engaging in lawfare against the US that they're successful in? I'm not sure what lawfare myself means, but maybe Jamil, you can help us.
Yeah, I mean, lawfare is the use of the legal system to achieve national security and foreign policy objectives by a nation state or economic objectives, right? And yeah, I mean, the Chinese engage in lawfare across the board with us, right? They're exploiting our IP system. They're exploiting the international system that we brought them into, the WTO and the like, to their benefit. And they're exploiting the standards bodies to their benefit, right? They're literally taking the architecture we built. By the way, we built it to help ourselves. Right? The whole theory of the case was the way we built the world telecommunication system, right? Benefited us, right? As Morgan can tell you, right? But the real challenge is that they have now figured that out and they're going to one-up us. And we are not playing equal ball. We've forgotten that we're a superpower in a million different ways. But in this way in particular, economically. And we need to leverage that capability and work collaboratively with our private sector to do that. We got to get on the same page, and we're just not there today. Not internally and not with our allies.
Any one final word for anyone? Jim? No? Okay.
System is rigged.
Okay.
It's rigged.
You heard it here first.
Okay, well, this has been a scintillating and invigorating discussion for me, at least. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists for their comments.